Hi there, and welcome on the journey to transform culture. I'm Steve, and I'll be your guide. Well, folks, today we're going to jump into a topic enabling. I know, right? Enabling. Well, this one is a deep one. I'm not going to jump into every element of enabling because, as you can imagine, it goes deep, far, and wide. But I do want to jump into it from essentially from an organizational perspective, and then we'll ripple outward as we go into regular culture and our normal relationships. Right? When you think of enabling, what comes to mind? Some of you may be familiar with it, pretty readily familiar with it, especially if it's in your specialty, and others of you may have no real clue except that you've heard it. You know, it's not a good thing, right? So, but we all do it in the tiny from on a spectrum from the tiniest fractal of enabling, where we somebody says, "Hey, does this shirt look good on me?" you know, and is being super harmless, but we do these sorts of things all the way up to the most extreme version where uh, we do things so much for others, or we provide for others their toxic habits, could be addictions, all those sorts of things, right? So those are two heavy. Well, one is a heavy extreme, and one is a mild, you know, a mild thing that we do probably the most often. We're going to kind of go into the more middle, common, everyday territory of organizationally related enabling. What can come across as enabling, and how it can it does absolutely hamstring your organization. One form of enabling is rating people higher than their capabilities, right? If you're rating people too high, then and they haven't finished training on certain things, then there's a mismatch there, because it should be in line with their competence, in line with their capabilities, right? So that's one way you see enabling. Another one, which is, in that similar training realm, is if new employees are coming to the organization, and let's say because of the type of job that you do, there's a training requirement, maybe they're assigned a trainer or a mentor or however, somebody to shadow, that sort of thing. If the trainer, right, doesn't have enough patience, or supervisor, because sometimes some organizations are small and they don't have, some of these things broken down to that level. But let's say it's a supervisor, but the supervisor lacks patience, and then that patience then becomes doing it for the employee, or stifling the employee's growth, not because you want to stifle them, but because they're unable to progress. And as they can't progress, then the supervisor steps in. And now what do you have? You have an employee, right? A team member who is very singularly, very linearly trained, or very, pretty much in just a specialty. Some people end up getting promoted because of this same thing. They get promoted into other positions because they're unable to do the ones that they should have been able to do when they first entered the organization. So essentially, they're enabled. They're enabled by being promoted out of being to doing the work that should be expected by somebody in their role. So these kinds of things happen, and then what that does is that sends a signal to the rest of the employees, and then you see a drop off in the motivational factor for others to want to grow similarly, because then they realize, well, if I just sit back, I mean, essentially somebody else is going to do the work for me. And so you have these specializations, right? And some specializations, as it relates to, say, functional people in organizations and leadership roles, those definitely are, there is a specialization there, right? But it should be born from the ability to do, right? At some point in somebody's career, they have been able to do certain things to be able to attain those roles. Uh, One example of this that may seem strange, but a functional. We'll use an engineer that maybe has a team of two or three, maybe even four, a handful, we'll say. And uh, and so they're the senior person for that small group. But you may have a supervisor over 70 people, right? For example, in an organization. Now, that supervisor's encountered so many, so much more variability in what it is to be able to lead, develop, mentor, grow team members than that functional leader is of that small group, especially because that's a specialized function anyway, right? So, an organization then that promotes, say, a functional leader like that, and let's say an engineering facet, to being put in charge of 500 or 1,000 people in an organization, we'll say at a site, right? They have just been thrust from having been able to deal with 4 or 5 people, maybe effectively, right? In a better than average sense, now to being in charge and having the oversight and responsibility of an entire site. Now, these are the kinds of, this is kind of enabling gone wild, right? And we could say that it's preferential treatment. We could say that it's, there's so many ways we could describe this as well. But there is a bit of an enabling. But in this regard, it's essentially I'm enabling this person by allowing them to progress into an arena that they have no business progressing into. And you see this in organizations where a lack of vision or a lack of foresight or a lack of planning and ability to handle rigorous and difficult things manifests. And then the team at large is very demoralized by this because, of course, they know that this person isn't able to lead. So it really just takes the air right out of the balloon. It deflates the team. It lowers motivation. It's just not a good thing. So this is a sort of enabling as well, right? But also enabling, I kind of come back to that training example. Anytime that we cut people short of their training or it's due to our lack of patience, that also can be a echo of the fact that that trainer was trained by somebody who also had a lack of patience and who cut them off at a certain point so that they now never progress beyond training in a particular area. Maybe they only train 3 out of the 7 different technical specialties or something of that sort. We're dealing with multiple organizations, massive organizations. So your examples could be far and wide, right? This could be an office setting. This could be a factory setting. This could be any setting. But if we're doing this, if those fractals we talked about in the beginning become much bigger than fractals, and a lack of patience all the way through the organizational chain becomes that a lack of patience is the theme. And now that becomes, I could have titled this just as easily lack of patience, but this is just one aspect. That lack of patience now becomes what? The result is I'm enabling these other folks. Why? Because I don't have the patience to see something through. Now, if you don't have the patience to see something through as a mentor, a leader, a trainer, then your team at large may not have the patience to see work through to the quality level that you're expecting, right? So it's very difficult to be surprised that your quality is suffering when the quality of how your people are trained and those expectations are also falling short along the way. And do you see how enabling now at every level becomes becomes a contributing force to the overall outcome of your product or service that you're providing for your customers? So enabling is a very difficult thing. Enabling too in the relational side of the house also becomes people, the old prima donna thing, where somebody's got, they may have decent skills and they can do the work, just maybe they're well above, there may be superior work, production of work is superior, but they are difficult people to work with, communicate with. Perhaps they lash out at people. Perhaps they're difficult, but then if the leadership team, the enabling where it can occur, and you can see when this happens, it's a prima donna effect where, well, I'm not going to address this and bring their feet gently back to the ground, hopefully early in the process. It's more gentle, right? And I can't afford to lose them. So if I don't do that early, and I can't afford to lose them, I'm enabling them. And now what is that leadership team and their functional leaders and others, what are they doing? They're making excuses. Or it's well, so and so, they're just grumpy, right? And that isn't to say we can't have a grumpy moment, but if a person has a particular way and it's a toxic thing, that's more than grumpy. And if we're allowing it to continue, we're enabling the bad behavior, right? And this behavior could be the same if we're talking about people who don't show up to work on time, people whose work is inconsistent. I mean, you can go right down the line with every issue that you have that's driving the effectiveness of your key performance indicators that says your organization is doing well or not. Start looking back at this. Where are we enabling each other, even in the minutest way, right? There's a difference between being kind and being nice. And, 50-50 on this one. I always thought, kindness was always the better approach. That doesn't mean we can't be direct and we can't be firm on something that's important. There is no lack of kindness. Now, you can be rude. You can go beyond being firm about a particular subject, not a person, but the subject, and you could be rude toward a person, right? And when we start getting into that rudeness, that toxicity, that passive aggressiveness, all those negative things start to go when we start to leave kindness behind, right? So nice, nice is somebody who's afraid to be firm, right? We can be too nice. We can kind of gaslight ourselves and essentially enable ourselves by saying, well, I have to be nice, right? So I'm not going to be direct. Or I'm not going to be, and I don't mean direct in the rude sense. I don't mean direct in, in a negative way. I'm saying be honest, be forthright and straightforward and genuine, right? That's direct, but about a particular matter. But we also enable others when we don't. And we're all guilty of it. We've all soft-sided the message just a little bit so that people don't feel bad. And look, folks, we're human. We're not perfect, okay? And it's okay, I believe, that we pull back when it comes to making somebody feel bad for no particular reason. But come at it from a different perspective and think of that as a challenge. How can you grow yourself into being more direct, more genuine, getting the message across without being mean or rude or condescending or toxic, right? How can you get your message across? What can you bring to the table? Now, people have to understand, yes, at first you're not going to be the most direct and you're going to try to find a pathway to reach this person. Sometimes you might have to use an analogy. You might have to say, well, kindness is king. You might have to go to a meme, uh, well, if we're struggling to be kind with each other, perhaps we're falling short with our customers. You put that on a t-shirt, right? So these are true. These are absolutely valid, and we can always include the we. I think we communicate better. I think we can be nicer or kinder, right? We can be more kindly toward one another and professional. We don't have to be rude and mean and toxic and all this kind of stuff. It's just not necessary. I was in the military, I'm retired Air Force, and we would, in a fun way, mess with each other, and but we wouldn't cross a line, right? That's not to say a line was never crossed, right? I'm sure the lines were crossed, but it wasn't the usual, right? Obviously, we have to respect one another, and when you understand that it's important to respect one another because we also want to be respected. When you disrespect me, you're saying that you don't deserve respect. Put that on a t-shirt if you want, right? Uh, you know, be mean, defame, do the things you're going to do, but you're saying that when you do those things, you don't deserve to be treated well either. And that's what you're really saying. And when somebody's treating you as if, in those toxic ways, then they're just saying that there's a brokenness there, right? So what we don't do is we don't enable that by being overtly disregarding toward being direct, but we tackle that and say, "Hey, look, this is what I'm picking up of what you're putting down, okay, and tell me I'm wrong or correct me, and what do what's the deal? Boom, boom, boom." And then, yeah, you might be direct, and it might be slightly argumentative, but always come back to your center. Always stay on center. Remember, people who are not in balance, right, who are not aligned, and they're not in balance, they're maybe you got a little prima donna, maybe you got a little narcissism thrown in there, maybe you got a little bit of a sociopath thrown in there. You don't know what you're dealing with, right? It's an unknown question mark, especially if you're the new person in an organization. Keep your one foot on kindness and professionalism. Keep one foot on that, right? And the other foot on being objective and being genuine and direct, but not harmful and toxic, right? If you do those things, more often than not, you're going to be fine. A lot of times, too, some of these folks will mirror your behavior, and that's not a bad thing if you're a decent person and you're trying to have a good outcome, right? You want harmony in your organization? Well, you better bring harmony to it. If you're a person who's bringing disharmony to the organization, then pretty quickly, if those people who are enabling allow it to continue, they're also saying, we're okay with disharmony in this organization. But as we also have known, because we've talked about this in previous videos, some people rely upon that as a distraction so that so that their work isn't scrutinized, or because they're afraid to be scrutinized. So in a sense, they're using this bullwhip effect, right? And they're enabling themselves by enabling the prima donnas. So you can see where enabling is just an awful thing, and it just creates a toxic loop that people struggle to break free from. So don't enable, right? But at the same time, keep one foot in kindness, professionalism, and you should be fine. All right, folks, we could go in all kinds of places with enabling, but I don't want this video to be crazy long. But I wanted you to get a feel for that. Remember, enabling, you're kind of covering for somebody else's toxic behavior or extreme behavior, or their isms that are not helping the team at large, or your group, your organization at large. They're basically allowing it to continue. They're covering for them for their addictions, essentially their addictions, their tendencies, right? All right, folks. Remember to hit that good domino, that good green domino, 3 to 5 times a day to uplift, motivate, inspire, and just encourage one another. And when you do that, not only are we helping to transform culture, right? Not only are we removing the need for having to enable, but we're also transforming our own lives. And that's a special thing, and never take it for granted. Okay, folks, hit like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, we'll talk to you later.